Network Reconnaissance, Part 2. In this nugget, we're going to discuss network reconnaissance, and this is part 2, where we address hping2, which is an alternative to the conventional ping command, which uses ICMP packets. Well, hping2 uses alternative methods to be able to ping destination hosts, and hopefully you can get better results out of it. It's got a very powerful tool that gives you lots of flexibility. And then TCP traceroute is an alternative to, of course, traceroute. And the advantage with this is it uses TCP packets to perform its pings, and that will get you some different results than just ICMP alone. We also take a look at Nmap. This is just the Swiss Army knife of hackers. It does so many different things, and there's so many different combinations of options that you can run with it that it gives you a great deal of flexibility and power in being able to perform network reconnaissance against a destination. Now, before we get too far along here, I want to just point out a couple of additional tools that we can use for basic network reconnaissance. Remember, if we were to do something like trace routes, and let me just choose a different website here. How about hey, here's a really good website just to look for up-to-date security information. That's iss.net. A really good Internet Security Systems website there. But I could just do a trace route there. Notice that it goes, of course, goes through my ISP and goes through certain hops and everything. And then right at about 19, I think it's, yeah, there it is. At 19 and anything further, I'm just going to get asterisks. So there's some kind of a firewall or some kind of a network device there that's blocking any further attempts for ICMP to get further on through. And I've done this before, so I know it's going to stop at 19. I'm not going to exhaust this. I'm just going to Control-C to cancel that right now. Next thing I'm going to do is to go to a different terminal window here. I'm just going to use two at once so you can refer back to this previous one visually. But I'm going to this time use a different tool called TCP trace route. TCP trace route to the same location, www.iss.net. And notice that this one, and among other things, it works pretty fast. But what we're going to see happening here is it's going to go past the 18th hop here. Notice we said Atlanta, raw, external. I'm sure that's an external firewall or something, route or something like that. And then that's as far as it got using traceroute. However, using TCP traceroute, we were able to go a couple of hops further there, and that gives us a couple of notches further into the network so that we can identify additional hosts that we could go against if we wanted to do that. Now, of course, I'm not going to hack iss.net. I wouldn't want you to either. It's a good site, good for useful information for security, so we wouldn't want to bring it down. But in any case, now we have an additional IP address here that we can work against. We have a couple of different IP addresses, in fact, that we can work against that we wouldn't have been able to see using traditional traceroute. Now, the next thing you might be wondering is, okay, great, James, thanks a lot, but how does it actually do this? Why is it that TCP traceroute does this when traceroute doesn't? Well, it's actually in the name, because you see traceroute uses ICMP packets, remember. Well, a lot of firewalls are just configured almost out of the box, just block ICMP. Nobody wants ICMP to get through. And that's where a lot of administrators will just leave this. However, TCP traceroute uses, as the name implies, TCP packets. And a lot of firewalls are configured to allow some kind of TCP through. So it allows the TCP through, and then we can kind of do a little bit of probing beyond the firewall by using TCP packets instead of UDP or ICMP echo packets. Now here we'll have another tool that we can use to circumvent traditional ICMP problems with things like firewalls and the like. Here we have hping2. Now notice that I'm going to again go to iss.net. You can do it by IP address or host name, by the way, if you have a way of resolving that. And then a -P against port 80. That means I'm going to send my pings against port 80 here. And I'm going to send an S, a -S there. That means to send a SYN packet with it. Okay, so what I'm going to be able to do here then is to let the destination know that I want to start a communication with it. Remember our three-way handshake? SYN is the first step, then SYN-ACK, and then ACK. Okay, so what we would want to see here if we're going to do normal TCP/IP communications with an S for SYN is that we would want to see a SYN-ACK come back from that client. Also, port 80 should work fine because after all, we're going to a web server here. So I'll press enter here. And again, just like ping, this just goes on indefinitely until you Control-C to stop it. Now, what am I getting back? Well, I'm getting back the IP address of the destination, time to live. I'm also getting the port 80 that I was working with. And here's the important part that I want to show you here. I did, in fact, get an SA, a SYN-ACK back. This means that port 80 is open. Now, the HPing2 utility is quite exhaustive, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing with you, but if you want to learn more about it, go to www.hping.org, and then if you just stop right there, it doesn't give you much. So go to man page after that, and that will give you the manual page here. Also gives you a link so you can download it. It is free to use. It gives you quite a lot of different options, and the usage for this is that we can do things such as testing firewall rules. We can remote OS, remote fingerprint the operating system on a destination machine. There's a list of all the different stuff it does. All different kinds of things you're capable of doing with this. One of the big advantages for using HPing is similar to TCP traceroute, is that we can use TCP instead of ICMP for all the things that we're trying to do here. And we can also use raw IP, which remember, when we talked about ports earlier, we said that we don't use port 0. Well, in fact, you're not supposed to, but you can with tools like this. And what will happen then is it's a good way to hide your ping, and it's going to be able to also give you a better chance of not being logged, because port 0 usually is not logged. And you can also manually specify this by going to -0, which is a raw IP mode that we can use. And then finally, if you still like Windows better than using Linux, there's another tool called SuperScan4. And this you can get from Foundstone. You can see over here, it's by Foundstone. It's free for download and use. When you do download this tool, you simply enter in the host name or the IP address, 10.10.10.39, for example. I think I got something that's using that. And then you just hit play and see what kind of results it gets you. That's just a security alert for my own firewall that I've got running here. Do I want to allow this to work or not? I'll just unblock that so that this application can work. And then once it does this, it's going to just scan against that destination. It's going to see if it's got any open ports. It looks like it's got port 137, which is quite common on Windows machines. And that's used for things like file shares. Once it's done, if you like, you can view the HTML results, and it'll open it all for you and kind of give it to you in a nicely packaged little way here so you can more easily read the results. There's a whole bunch of other tabs here, which again, I'm not going to exhaust, but here you can adjust your different options, whether you want it to be a UDP port scan or a TCP port scan, which ports you want to use, what kind of scan options you want available. For example, this one might be kind of interesting as well, depending upon whether you're doing a penetration test or a vulnerability test. Remember, a vulnerability test doesn't require really any stealth. For that, I could kick this up all the way to the fastest speed. For stealth, I want to go really, really slow. I don't want them to see a whole flurry of packets coming from me right here. So I'd slow this way, way, way down so that it wouldn't be quite as obvious. And then you have a number of different tools here, too. You can do some things that we see with other tools we've looked at earlier in this series, such as doing a hostname lookup or doing something like a whois, that kind of thing. And then we can do Windows enumeration as well. This works, of course, obviously, with Windows hosts. You simply enter in the IP address of that host and specify which options you want it to look up, and then you go ahead and click Enumerate, and that'll give you some results about, again, what's going on that destination operating system. Well, we've used some pretty good scanning tools, and there are literally hundreds of different port scanning methods that could be used out there. A lot of those tools are pretty obscure, and so, of course, we're not going to address those. But the granddaddy of all network reconnaissance tools is something called Nmap, written by a guy named Fyodor, F-Y-O-D-O-R. He is a masterful hacker that's pretty well regarded as the hacker, and he gets a lot of respect just because he wrote Nmap. Well, in any case, let's take a look at what Nmap does for us. One of the things that it can do is it uses a three-way method for ensuring that a port is open. You see, the other tools we've used so far, they help me to identify whether a host is up, but I don't really know anything else about that host. What ports does it have open? Once I find out what ports it has open, that might help to identify what kind of a server or client that is. So Nmap can help to identify which ports are open for us. And it uses a three-way handshake to make that happen. And that's also something we call TCP Connect scanning. Now the disadvantage of that is that most firewalls or IDSs can easily detect a TCP Connect scan and may shut you down right away. But there are other methods that you can still use within Nmap to be able to hopefully circumvent some of those kinds of things. Now the default Nmap ping is going to be an ICMP echo request followed by an ACK to port 80. And the reason why we use 80 is, once again, because a lot of firewalls will have that open because they might have some kind of an HTTP management console back there or a web server or something like that that makes that available. Now, before we get too far along with Nmap, let's talk about the kind of TCP scan types that it can do. And this is just a short list of the many, many things that Nmap can do. But one of the first and most common things you would do would be to do a TCP connect. And that would be with the option -S capital T. This is all case sensitive, by the way, as with many Linux things. Also, there's a Windows version of Nmap if you like to use the Windows version. In any case, there's a full three-way handshake that will take place with this, similar to what we've seen happen with other tools. This, again, is going to be a very reliable way of determining whether or not that destination host is up and what ports it's running. And Nmap will return to you ports that it thinks are open or available. And then there's also TCP SYN. This is going to be also known as a half open, because remember, in our three-way handshake, you have what? You have SYN, SYNAC, and ACK. All right. Well, with a SYN or half open one, all it does is it sends a SYN, then the host will reply with a reset ACK response if the host is not listening on that port. However, if it is listening on that port, then it will send back a SYN ACK packet, as you would expect to happen in any normal communication. The only difference between this bottom one and this top one here is that in the third step, the source never sends back the finishing ACK there. Now, this could leave you in a situation where you'll unintentionally, perhaps, set up a denial of service item because you have too many half-open sessions going on. You'll also possibly trigger some kind of an IDS with this, because all of a sudden, if there's dozens of half-open sessions going on and there's no actual ACK to complete those sessions, then that looks just suspicious. So again, this is better for a vulnerability test than it would be for a pen test. And then there's also a TCP FIN, which is identified, I forgot the dash there, but with a -SF. Actually, I guess I forgot that with all the rest of these. With a -SF, and this is going to send a FIN packet. Now remember, a FIN packet is how we normally do a gentle close with a session. So in this case, we're sending a FIN to somebody we've never even started talking to in the first place. And if we get a reset response back, that means that that port was closed. And by the way, this all kind of begs the question, what port? Are we scanning against port 80? Are we scanning against port 21? Port 60,000? Who knows? Well, Nmap uses a common list of ports that are frequently used. It uses the first 1024, of course, and then it uses certain select other ones as well. But if you want to scan against specific port numbers, you can always do that as well, and you just type that into the command line when you do your Nmap. By the way, this only works with Unix hosts. Also, there's a TCP Christmas tree attack that's a -S uppercase X, and this will send a FIN, an urgent pointer, and a push flag all at the same time. So they're lit up like a Christmas tree with all these flags turned on. That's why we call it this. What happens there is if you get a reset response, again, the port is closed. That's common. Anytime you get a reset back, usually that's going to mean that the port is just closed. Now, with an SN, this is going to be known as a null scan, where there are no flags sent, and there's going to be a reset response again if the port is closed. Now, this last one's kind of interesting. This is a TCP ACK with a -PT. This is only going to send an ACK. It's not really to test out so much the destination host that we're trying to get to. This is really more of a test against the firewall. Let me, first of all, explain a little bit of the difference between two different kinds of firewall. There's either a packet filtering firewall or a stateful firewall. And the best way to understand all of this is to first understand what a stateful firewall is, as opposed to a packet filtering firewall. A stateful firewall uses a table to keep track of any communication that has taken place between its internal network and an external network. So, for example, this might be a corporate network over here. Keep marking things up. And this might be the external internet or some other network over here. Well, if this client here wants to establish a session with this other client over here, outside of the firewall, it can do so. The stateful firewall is usually pretty liberal about what traffic it allows to be outbound. It has kind of an assumption that if I initiate the traffic from within my corporation, then it's going to be safer than someone doing unsolicited traffic into my corporation here. And it keeps track of, it uses a little table here that keeps track of which servers and clients here inside my network have generated sessions outside the network. So if this stateful firewall knows that this computer here has an established session with this computer here, it won't be unusual for it to see an ACK packet come back through. Now, if it sees that I've already got a session established here with this computer, then it will say, oh, you're supposed to be able to send ACKs back through because this computer will be expecting it, and it'll allow that packet to go through. However, if this client here never started a session and never got a session going with this client here, if I just send an unsolicited ACK through here, the firewall says, hey, wait a minute. It's kind of like an exclusive nightclub. It'll say, hey, you're not on my list. You're not getting through because you don't know anybody inside of my exclusive nightclub over here. So in any case, this is the beauty of a stateful firewall. It keeps track of all the communications that have been generated from within the network. Therefore, it knows what to expect back from the external network. Now, the packet filtering firewall has no such intelligence like I just showed you. There's no table here. There's no exclusive list of club members or people that know people inside of my exclusive network here. What would happen here then is this client here could just send in an unsolicited ACK, and the firewall says, hey, I don't have a list. I don't know who's supposed to be here and who's not supposed to be here. So just go on ahead and get in. And it'll do this regardless of whether or not this computer here has ever initiated a session with some computer on the outside. Another thing we'll need to understand before we start using Nmap is the difference between a filtered, an unfiltered, and an open port. A filtered port simply means that when I try to send my traffic through, and I just pick this out of the air, we're going to send a TCP SYN packet over port 80. And we use port 80 a lot, again, because a lot of firewalls allow port 80 in, because somewhere in here might be a HTTP server somewhere. So in any case, if the firewall has a rule that blocks port 80, then that's going to be called a filtered port. In reality, I might actually have an HTTP server back here. But maybe it's only intranet only or has some other special purpose. And so even though it's got web pages on it and it's got port 80 open on this box itself, the firewall is not allowing it. So I'm never going to know whether I've got port 80 open on this server back here. Actually, there's other ways around that. But at least initially, when I run my first scans, that's what I'll run into, is that port 80 is filtered. Now, conversely, I might have an unfiltered port, also known as a closed port. In this particular case, when I send my TCP SYN packet to the firewall does allow that port to be open. So it's going to go ahead and send that traffic on through. However, maybe this isn't an HTTP server. Maybe this is a mail server that I'm trying to reach here. Well, if that's the case and it doesn't have port 80 open, it's going to send back a reset ACK to me. Okay. And in that particular case, yeah, that's going to prove to me that the firewall allows port 80 through. It just so happens, however, that this is not an HTTP server. It's got other ports open, but not 80. And then finally, we have an open port. And this is a lot of times what we're really looking for. So here I'll send my TCP SYN packet again. And this is, again, of course, is this first part of a three-way handshake. So maybe I'm just doing an ST scan. And I'm trying to go to this server right here. Maybe this is my HTTP server inside the network. Well, if it is, and we send our packet in there, this is going to respond with a SYN ACK, because it's saying, hey, yeah, I see you're trying to reach my IP address. I see you're trying to reach port 80. I do have port 80 open, and I'm running services on port 80. I'm running my HTTP server there. So I'm going to send back to you a SYN ACK so that you can complete a connection. When we see that this is an open port, it's a pretty good chance that that is indeed my HTTP server. Well, now that we have an understanding of those things, let's take a look at Nmap itself. Here, if you type Nmap from a terminal window, you'll see the common usages that it allows you through here. And this is going to be really important. It looks just like, oh, great, here's another help page. Okay, what's next, James? Well, let's just pause here for a minute, because this is more important than that. This is a Certified Ethical Hacker exam objective, and it's a very, very important one. I would memorize this page. Print it out. Take a screenshot, whatever you need to do, make sure you know this page. I also would read through the man page, and like any other Linux command, just type man followed by the name of the command, so it would be man space nmap in this case, and I would really read through that entire man page. It's going to be pretty important in order to be able to understand and use Nmap well. All right, well, let's take a look at how we can use Nmap then. Here I've used Nmap, and I've done all these commands in advance because some of them take several minutes to run, so I just did them in advance to show you later. In any case, there's Nmap-st. Remember, that's going to do the TCP three-way handshake. -v is verbose, -v is very verbose. And then there's the IP address of the host that I'm trying to connect with. Then we just go ahead and start this scan, and the goodies here are down at the bottom. where it shows me the open ports that are on this destination. Now, what could be telling about this is which ports are open. For example, I might want to identify, first of all, what operating system I'm working with here. Just so you know, this is a Windows Server 2003 server that at this point does not have the Windows firewall turned on. Well, it's got port 139 open. This is a very common Microsoft port for NetBIOS. That's what we use for things like file and printer sharing and things like that. There's also 445, which is used for Microsoft networking for directory services or Active Directory. What else we got? Here's a good one, 3389. That's used for terminal services or for remote desktop. So we see common ports there. This is pretty much a dead giveaway that this is a Microsoft system. Now, another thing I've done here is I've done the same command, except this, in this particular instance, I added a -P0. That's not PO, that's P0, and that will prevent it from sending ICMP pings. You see, by default, Nmap will send an ICMP packet, and then it only scans those hosts that respond to the ICMP packet. But if a firewall blocks ICMP, you're not going to scan any hosts. So what this would do is it would avoid sending ICMP packets, and that, in many cases, is a better way to go. So in any case, this gives us very similar results to what we saw before. So there's nothing really new there because I didn't have a firewall up anyway. Then let's go ahead and take a look at what we have down here at this next one. And this is where things get a little bit interesting. Again, my command really here is the same exact command. I did not change a single thing there. But take a look at the results. Boy, that looks different. It has TCP 21, 23, 25, 80, 10, and then some of these are open, some of these are closed, and it identifies various services. Whereas in my previous list here, it gave me different port numbers, except with a couple of exceptions, or one exception there. It gave me different port numbers and stuff, so what's the difference? Well, the difference is I went ahead and turned on that Windows firewall. So I turned on the Windows firewall, and I allowed certain ports through, but not others. Let's go ahead and take a look at how that looks. Here's this firewalled host over here. I'm going to go to its properties, and if I go to advanced, this is where you configure the Microsoft firewall for Windows Server 2003 or Windows XP. So I did enable it by enabling the firewall there, and if I go to settings, notice that I'm allowing through certain ports here. FTP, I'm allowing SMTP, POP3, remote desktop, that's where my 3389 is coming from, and HTTP for port 80. Okay, so now we see that, I'm allowing those ports through. Let's analyze this a little further. And the first thing we have here is TCP port 21 and 3389. Remember, I have services that are bound to those ports. That's why those particular ports are open, because if you remember from our open discussion here, if the firewall is open to the port, and if there is a service bound to the port on the box that we're trying to get to, then it's going to send back a SYN ACK to the original client here, and that's how we know that that port is open. So if we go back here as well, we also see that there's a couple of these that are closed, or a few of these that are closed. Let's investigate that again and review what that's about. So if I go over here to unfiltered or closed, again, that means that the firewall has that port open. So it's able to go through the firewall, but there's no service bound to that port on the actual server. So that's why it's sending back a reset back to the querying client. And as a result, what we get in our results here is closed. And then returning back here again, we see that, let's just look at some other information while I'm here. This connect scan took, how long? 400 seconds. So you see that does take a while. What is that, about 6.5 minutes, I guess. So it took 6.5 minutes to scan 1,601 ports, including well-known ports as well as other ports that Nmap keeps track of as commonly used for common services. In any case, then also 1,595 ports are scanned but not shown in the state below are filtered. So anything that does not appear here is a filtered port. And remember, what a filtered port is here, if I can get to the right screen there, is when the firewall blocks the query here, so there's a rule here, and it never gets to the client. So it's just blocked at a cold stop right at the firewall. And then just to show you another example here, remember what we did up above was an ST scan, just a TCP Connect scan, which is a little noisy, can be easily detected. This one is a SYN scan, where did I put it? There it is, Nmap-S capital S. Again, we're not sending ping packets. That also helps to lower our profile so that the destination firewall doesn't see a bunch of ping packets coming from us and trigger some kind of an IDS. Again, verbose, verbose. In any case, because of the SS, it's a ceh stealth scan, so it's less likely to be noticed, but it gives me the same results right here. A ceh scan is probably not as reliable as a full connect scan, but it's still pretty good for most purposes. If I see ports that look like they're open here, I would just have to take a couple of additional steps to confirm that they really do have a service running on them and that they're available for me to hack. Now here also, I've run something called a null scan. Now I just repeated the command down here because this scrolled so far, if I go all the way to the top here, it scrolled so far that I lost the original command up there. So I just typed it in here again down at the bottom to show you what I did to generate this data. Nmap-S capital N, that's a null scan, again not using ICMP pings, and verbose, verbose. With this one, it goes through all of the ports, but it doesn't send any flags along with them. And this, again, is a very stealthy way of getting the information back that you need. However, the drawback to this is it can take an extremely long period of time to get the data back that you want. So this one took 1,940 seconds to get the results back. In fact, it was taking so long that I thought it was hung or something. I almost terminated it, but it finished doing this job right towards the end here, and I saw that we did get a result. So in any case, that gives you another idea for what you can use for scanning. Do notice another thing as well here, by the way. It's not as reliable as some of the other ones we've got. Remember, I do have 2 ports that are open and listening on that IP address, but using my null scan here, it says that all 1601 scan ports are filtered, so it's not showing those 2 that are actually up. It does show me that the host is up, however, so at least I get that information out of it. And in this example, I'm using ST again for a TCP connect attempt, but I'm also putting on there a -PT. What's that? And that's going to send a TCP ACK packet to the destination. However, notice that I do not have a -P0 here. Remember that Nmap will again send an ICMP packet to all of its potential targets, and then if it gets a response back, it'll continue on to do any of the other instructions I've put into this. If it doesn't get an ICMP echo back, then it just stops. Well, that's what happened in this case because my firewall blocks ICMP. Therefore, it assumes that everything is down because it never got an answer back from any of those. So by adding in here a -P0, then I'm going to tell it to not use the ICMP packets, just to go ahead and skip that part and to do only the scan itself. Now I'm able to get results once again. And in this case also, notice that really I'm getting the same results that I've had before. So even though I changed a little bit of the syntax of what I was doing up here at the top, I'm not getting many different results. Well, that's okay. Again, using Nmap, you try it a number of different ways against your destination hosts to see if any of the results vary, and then you can help to weed out any potential false positives, for example. That's one reason why I want to try running Nmap a few different ways before confirming what you think you've got going on the other end. The other thing, by the way, is that, let me go back over to this PT thing again. With a PT, it just sends that TCP ACK packet. Well, what's significant about that? Well, remember how a 3-way handshake takes place. The client sends a SYN packet. The server sends back a SYN ACK, and then the client sends back an ACK. Well, in this case, we've never talked to that server before, but we're sending in an ACK as if we'd had an ongoing conversation in the past. Well, if we just send an ACK to that server, the server will say, hey, wait a minute. You're talking like we know each other. I don't know you. So it'll just send back a reset saying, I don't know who you are, but must be the wrong number. So it sends back a reset when we try to query against that port. Now in this example, I've used Nmap again with all the same options we've used in the past with the exception of one new thing here, this -0. And what does that do? That helps to identify what operating system you're running. And that's going to be critical in determining what kind of an exploit you can run against this system, because different operating systems obviously have different exploits against them, and also depending upon which service pack they have and how long they've been up and so forth. So in any case, I'm trying to determine what the operating system is of .39 here. And it's not always successful, but we'll see what happened here. So anyway, it was able to identify the same ports again, so that's nothing new right there. But when we get down here, it says no exact OS matches your host. And then it gives you a URL if you want to learn about it a little bit more. Here's just some of the data that was sent back for the TCP/IP fingerprint, and it's supposed to be able to match this against a database of well-known operating systems, and depending upon how they respond to various queries from within Nmap's packets that are sent out. So in any case, it wasn't able to figure out what was going on there. So I went to a different host here. By the way, that was my Windows Server 2003 server. I thought I would be able to figure it out, but apparently it had a little trouble with it this time. In this particular case, I went to a different server, .43, which is a Linux host, and as I move on down to this one, we see that it did correctly guess that this was a version of Linux. So with that one, I was able to derive information out of how it responded to certain packets and determined that operating system determination. Oh, one other thing I wanted to point out. Uptime, 3.566 days since it was last rebooted is basically what that's telling us. Why is that important? Because, as I mentioned earlier in this series, maybe there was a patch that came out yesterday, a critical patch that patches up a known vulnerability that I can take advantage of. But that patch requires a reboot of the operating system. Well, if this system hasn't been rebooted for 3.5 days, I know that they have not applied that patch, therefore I can still possibly use that exploit against this system. In this nugget, we discussed network reconnaissance, and this was part 2, where we started off with a discussion of the hping command. Remember, hping is a very powerful tool that goes beyond just the conventional ping command with ICMP packets. And with hping 2, you can get a lot further along than you could otherwise with just ping alone. And then we saw a similar result with TCP traceroute, in that we can use TCP packets instead of ICMP packets. With those TCP packets, we can get past firewalls that would have otherwise blocked ICMP packets. So a pretty powerful tool there. And then, of course, the Swiss Army knife of all tools for us right now is going to be Nmap when it comes to network reconnaissance. This allows us to footprint our networks a lot more thoroughly. And it gives us a very powerful suite of different options that we can use in probing those networks.